Hi. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Prof. Tedam. I'm a professor of racial justice and social work in this building. I'm delighted today to introduce to you Dr. Tam Kane, who is an academic researcher at the Department of Social Work, University of Sussex. Tam is also a researcher in assisted reproductive health, adoption, and decision-making processes in social work. And recently, Tam has developed a framework called the AFDiT, which she might try and tell you a bit about, that aims to look at how academic social workers in practice or social care practitioners might adapt their practice to meet the cultural needs of children. Tam has published widely, including a couple of papers with me, but I actually met Tam in the flesh only 2 years ago. We had been working remotely during the period of COVID. So I'd like to welcome Tam to this session today. She also has a 2-hour seminar online workshop on Thursday. If you're interested in that, we'll give you the details to log in, and that's a practical application of her framework to practice. We'd like to thank Geary, and we just want to say that they're recording this session, so if you can keep your questions to the end, that will help with the recording. So, Tam, a warm welcome to UCD, and we look forward to hearing from you.
I don't wear my glasses, I can't see you, so I better put them on. So nice to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me, Prospera, and of course Geary. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, I always get confused whether I've been in Dublin or Belfast before. It's a conversation I've tried to have a few times. So actually, after clarity, it's actually Belfast, not Dublin. So it's good to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation. What I want to do today is to just hopefully try and share some of the learning from our research around transracial placements, with particular focus on adoption, although I will touch on fostering because I don't think we can see children through adoption without thinking about fostering anyway, so I will include that, but the research mainly stems from adoption work and transracial adoption. So before we kind of delve into much of the research, I guess my starting point, so while we're still thinking about culture, I just want to talk about this jacaranda tree here that you can see. So when I was growing up, this was some of, if you know Harare, which is where I'm from, Zimbabwe, and the city was full of these jacaranda falls, so beautiful. And in my land, when we're growing up, our yard, as we call it, there was so much of this jacaranda falls. It's beautiful, it's magical when it's like that, when it's purple, I think. So I just want to introduce the beauty of the jacaranda fall. When you see it laid on the carpet like that, it looks like a beautiful carpet, doesn't it, when it's fallen on the floor. And for me, it represents cultural pride, and it represents my heritage as well. And we want to think about that in terms of some of our children, and I'll connect this as we carry on. But also, for me, this jacaranda fall represents hope and growth. So when we then want to think about the jacaranda, when it rains, it's not great. It's not great. It's slippery, okay? And also with time, what happens is it really becomes sluggy and it stinks, yeah? So those are some of the hidden challenges of the beauty of the jacaranda. Beautiful to have there, beautiful carpet, beautiful color, but actually what we're seeing is later on it's going to be transformed and it's going to be sluggy, it's smelly, and it's disgusting. Having said that, it's not, I remember, because our yard was so big, it's not something that you would enjoy doing on your own. Okay, so it's something that required collective work to do, to kind of sweep this off the ground. So it's not a one-man task, I think, to sweep off this jacaranda, actually. So I'm just going to leave that there and just really think about some of our children in the context of cultural pride, cultural heritage, and actually when we get things wrong, what we're going to get is that slugginess and the smell of the jacaranda, something that has transformed from something so beautiful. And we want to think about that process of adoption. It starts off really beautiful, but when you get things wrong, it becomes quite sluggy. I'll talk about that as we carry on. So just really to move to the context, I'm going to talk about the context within which I'm coming from in terms of this research, which is obviously the British context. So if we want to think about transracial placements in the UK, this started off in the 1950s, 1960s, when we started seeing communities becoming much more diverse. And there was an overrepresentation of black and minority children in care. And at that time, those children were being adopted within white families. Okay, so there was a need to think about what do we need to do to ensure that these children feel a sense of belonging and they're supported with their sense of identity. One could argue at that point, it was that love is enough. Love is enough, the children are placed, and they've got everything that they need. But what was missing was the cultural support and their heritage. So we then see some discourses emerging, particularly coming from the US, filtering into the UK, actually around, these mixed placements and interracial placements are having a negative impact on the identity of children. What do we need to do about this? Then we saw the Children Act 2002, and within the Children Act 2002, there was an attempt to address the negative impact of transracial placements, particularly in regards to children's identities. At that point, the legislation was changed to include race and cultural consideration, that race and culture should be given due consideration when we're matching children, particularly in fostering as well as adoption. Then we carry on as you do in practice. And one of the things that the legislation didn't do was to give clear guidance around how do you do this. So what was clear then was that we're now seeing black children remaining in fostering for much, much longer than they should, because what practitioners were looking for was a perfect match. And you can't really get a perfect match. So because of that concerns, there was a big evaluation of the system, the NARI report, for those who know about the UK context, which then raised concerns around actually looking for a perfect match is resulting in a compromise in the children's welfare. So let's rethink this. 2014, the need to consider cultural matches was therefore removed from legislation. Yeah, there's no need to think about due consideration of ethnic and culture, because we need to prevent delays of the adoption of children, particularly those who are black and mixed race. Now in 21st track, we look at the statistics now from the Department for Education 23 and 24. So if we think about the number of children in care, we've got about 83,630. This is the breakdown. Mixed race children, 11%, 5, 7, and 5 again, particularly other ethnic origins. Those are the statistics of the children in care. But what we have is that with those statistics, we don't have enough black or Asian foster carers to look after the children in care. So of 82% of white foster carers, we only have 25 to 28% of ethnic minority children being looked after by in mixed race placement, because we haven't got enough foster carers. Then we move forward in terms of adoption. So 84% of children adopted are white, and then we only have 2% of children who are black. That is in comparison to 6.47 placed for adoption. So they're placed for adoption, but only 2% are adopted. And then you've got 1 children of Asian background being adopted. So even with those statistics, what you then see is that we only have 2.7% of approved adopters. So in terms of the statistics, what we have is that we've got more black children in the care system with less adopters and less foster carers. So what that means for our children is that they then have to be transracially adopted or transracially fostered. So while this is great in terms of policy, there is no need to look at ethnic and cultural matches, because we don't want these children to remain in the system for longer. We now have a system where we have, unfortunately, there's reports and concerns around what this is doing in terms of identity for children and a sense of belonging. And I'm just going to give you some narratives here in terms of what that means. So the dominant narrative at the moment is that, let's go back to the Jacaranda Falls. Okay, it's great. Children are moving, they're not remaining longer in the system. But what we have is those hidden, slippery challenges. That what we're seeing is racial trauma for children. And the concerns that we're having, what we're also seeing is that the oversimplification of identity. And part of that might also mean that, for example, an Asian child or a black child is being considered as in a monolithic way, without really looking clearly at their unique identities and what exactly that they need to be supported to understand who they are in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of their race, in terms of their culture. What we're also seeing are concerns around color blindness and ethnic blindness and cultural erasure, purely because when you listen to the narratives, I'm going to talk about those later on, is that you hear from people with lived experience saying, actually, it was as though my culture and my ethnicity never really existed because I needed to fit in with the foster carers' identities and their culture and the adoptive parents' culture because theirs has completely been erased. It's got no place in their household. Then there's arguments about racial and identity silence, that the identity is not being spoken about because it's not very relevant within the context of the placement. Or you're hearing arguments around actually when race and ethnicity are considered in terms of socialization, this is done at a tokenistic level. So you might think about maybe a Chinese child who's being transracially adopted and actually taking you to a Chinese restaurant is good enough. Okay, so that's tokenism, but that's not really part of the everyday life within the fostering. So, and then of course, minimizing the importance of heritage and belonging. The point about expectation of gratitude is a big one in terms of adoption narratives, actually, as a concern that adoptees are expected to be grateful for being adopted. But actually, and then you then want to think about what does that mean? And then maybe the savior narratives. What does that mean in terms of everything else around the child's sense of self, everything else in regards to the child's identity that's being omitted? So there's a real challenge around that. And of course, the assumption that adoption is going to fix the child in terms of whatever challenges that they've had. These are all narratives from research. You'll see the reference list at the end. So these are really concerning narratives when you really want to think about the experiences of children. So love is not enough, particularly when there's cultural erasure, particularly when we're thinking about cultural genocide. And I know some of these terminologies and terms can be quite complex to challenge, especially when there is genocide elsewhere. But when you look at narratives of children in care and children who've been adopted, or indeed adult adoptees, they talk about cultural genocide as something that has had a significant impact on them. Okay, so just really thinking about some of the recent research within this context, the impact is that we know that children, particularly if I'm speaking about the UK context, who end up in adoption, some of those children would have moved placements 3-4 times. And throughout that period, it's possible that they have not experienced anybody who looks like them in terms of the care that they're receiving. No ethnic match, no cultural match, sometimes no racial match. So this means as they're going through, their identity experience is that it's possibly fluctuating and it's changing throughout as they progress on through adoption. But we also know, if we're thinking about Saria Chevreul's work, and she talks about how identity sometimes can be like a seesaw, and she talks about identity influx. So sometimes if you think about a seesaw, one element of identity might be heavier than the other, and sometimes can be, differently at different times for a child. And we need to think about what does that necessarily mean for children. And I'll talk about that when I introduce the framework later on. So feelings of reconnection, disconnection and rejection are really, really clear in there. And Branco and colleagues talks about concerns around that you don't realize who you are because your narrative has been changed. And I'll talk about epistemic injustice. Your narrative about why you've been adopted has been changed. And the truth about who you are in terms of your identity sometimes is withheld. And we can talk about how that happens, whether it's because in social work, we are doing a great job or not around understanding children's identities and recording them. We can question that. Or it can also be concerns that we hear from research around possibly adopters not necessarily being quite open around the child's identity and their narrative, because sometimes that can cause some level of discomfort, I suppose. So this is something that I want to talk about in terms of some of the research around racial trauma, to just remind ourselves that when we're thinking about adoption, sometimes children are carrying invisible pain and homelessness, psychological homelessness as a result. And that is invisible, and sometimes we can't necessarily see that. So the invitation for us is to really go deeper and really understand that for children who are transracially placed, what is it that's going on for them that sometimes they can't necessarily verbalize, because that pain and the trauma is often invisible. Okay, so I'm going to come to AFDiT in a minute, but I think it's important to think about the context of George Floyd and what that did to us, really. So thinking about George Floyd going back to 2020, this was a big call, I think, or a reminder to all of us that we really need to be really thinking about, let's rethink about what we're doing in terms of anti-oppressive practice, anti-discriminatory practice, and what has happened to anti-racist practice, I think. So an invitation to us, and sadly, I always say it didn't really take a black man to die for us to think about this, and unfortunately, this is what happened. So this allowed us to really think about, let's have a look at what's going out there and what's going on in fostering, particularly when I was doing this research. And some of that came from the ideas that Professor Tedam and I were doing in the work that we were undertaking during COVID, particularly with the lens of racial consciousness, wrestling race, that this is the reality that most people who lived accessing services are wrestling with race, and they're experiencing racism within the system, and it's very difficult for them to confront systemic injustices or racial disparities within the system. Then, of course, the idea of intentionality, that we really need to be thinking about being intentional when we're working with minoritized ethnic groups. But I will come to that, because those are practice models of the framework that I'm going to talk about. So I just wanted to just highlight that we got here because of this journey, actually, and COVID, for me, made me realize, although my work is adoption, I realized actually there's a big gap within adoption and transracial adoption, and we really need to be thinking about supporting children in the system and introducing new ways of thinking. So in doing that, we managed to get funding from the British Academy. And as this work was carrying on, the Adoption UK became interested in the work, which supported us to roll out the research to more than just one pilot site. So that became a national study. So what we did is we interviewed adult adoptees who were transracially adopted. So that was one-to-one interviews. And what we were interested in is to find out, let's have some reflections about your experience in transracial adoption. What learning can we get from that? And what is it that you think practice needs to change? From then, we developed some co-creation sessions, and we developed the framework. And within those co-creation sessions, we had voices of adopters, voices of adoptees, and also social workers, alongside voices of birth parents. So we had 8 agencies we piloted once we developed the framework, including birth parent interviews. I think it was important to do separate birth parent interviews, particularly because of the sensitivities around this in this work. So it was important to be very, very sensitive around that. So we developed a pilot of AFDiT, and alongside that, we held several consultation sessions with agencies to find out how is it working, where can we develop, and what else can we do to make sure that the framework is going to be as robust as possible. So as we conducted this work, what was really clear from the narratives, particularly of adult adoptees, was the idea that transracial adoption can be a context of trauma. So this is a narrative now that we're hearing. Transracial adoption is trauma if we don't change the way we do things, right? So, and then I've already spoken about cultural genocide, which is the idea of systemic destruction of someone's culture, someone's identity, and indeed that they're a distinct group of people, and that we need to be providing support for them. So this was really clear that there's been an attack on cultural identity. And when you look at Gilski's work, it's really thinking about willful destroying of identities. So, and you could argue in this context that sometimes it doesn't happen willfully. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. But I think when we're then hearing narratives from people who have been adopted or who experience this, and you look at research, including the the Black Care Experienced research, which is really talking about attack on cultural identity, I think there's a lot of learning from there. So I think for me, it's an invitation to really think about what does cultural genocide look like, particularly in the work that we're doing, and what is the role that we have to try and disrupt this. Then Branco and colleagues talk about the idea that it takes waking up from the great sleep to know that I was robbed of my identity. And I think this is an important quote. And Branco and colleagues are all adopted colleagues who are researchers as well in the States. So being robbed from great sleep, that actually, that was not my identity. To then think about those repressed feelings and thoughts around my identity. So they introduced an adoption consciousness model. And I think it's important, and the question I always have there when we reflect on that quotation is to think about actually who's put adoptees and children who are transracially placed to that great sleep. For them to wake up later on while they're really seeking to understand their identity. So then we think about that idea of epistemic trauma and epistemic injustice, which goes back to what I was talking about in terms of the harm that is produced when we're not really clear or being honest about the adoption narratives, I suppose. And when we think about epistemic trauma, we need to think about what is it exactly that has been put in place that prevents adoptees or any child really who's transracially placed to claim their identity. What are the barriers within the system, and who is producing that narrative? Whose truth is it, and what way is the truth, particularly when there's undermining of lived reality? So alongside those additional findings, we hear from practitioners actually in the co-creation saying, well, actually, we haven't really been thinking about transracial placements in the context of trauma. So it was evident that there's lack of race trauma thinking in practice. And it was clear that we are not so confident in having conversations about identity and culture, and that this is really important. We need to be confident, and that's no surprise actually, because this came from other pieces of work that we had done, particularly in COVID, where we had social workers saying we're not confident to talk about race. And that was a theme as well here. So that idea of technical matching, and I know the challenge with the legislation removing the due consideration of matching, but what we are still hearing is that there's still a focus on technical matching in practice. We're looking for a perfect match. And that actually looking at identity, this was really, really clear, not necessarily looking at the complexity of interlocking identities. And sometimes we see children's profiles that just say Muslim, or Black, or Asian, female, and there's no additional information about actually what does this all mean? Who is this child then? You know, what does Asian mean? What does Muslim mean? So there was no understanding, I suppose, in the absence of that. What does that mean? Let's look at it in a way that we're breaking down, so that when we're thinking about matching, we're also exploring adopter's profile, so that we look for somebody who's able to meet the child's needs. So again, that links to the point around missing the psychological connection of identity. So in some contexts, there was also a one-size-fits-all. And not just in terms of practice, but also one-size-fits-all in terms of the training that is provided to prepare adopters, to prepare foster carers, I would argue as well, that they're ready to adopt. So without necessarily looking at cultural nuances in respect of the children coming to the system. So here I just really want to talk about how I would argue the system contributes to race trauma, particularly in the area of adoption. And I think sometimes we miss the intergenerational nature of systemic racism. So perhaps if I contextualize this, it's really about actually when birth families come through the child welfare system and having their children removed, they may well have experienced racial discrimination themselves, racial trauma, maybe previously in the care system, but also maybe in other intersectional systems as well, housing, for example. Yeah, maybe, and we also know if we think about maternity services and their experiences there as well. So all these other services that they might be experiencing, and there wasn't really that thinking around looking at it at an intergenerational level, and the impact that it then has on the child when the child then is within the child welfare system, moving in the adoption system. We also heard from the statistics that children from these cultural backgrounds are remaining in the system for longer. And the reality is that that is also systemic trauma for them as well, if we think about it in terms of what is happening for them when they move from placement to placement and sitting in the system longer while other children are moving very fast in the system to be adopted or fostered. Then this point about dare not to ask, this is really comfortable. I'm not necessarily going to have conversations about what does this identity mean? What maybe was your experience to birth parents around your own trauma, your own experiences of racism, and what is it that we then need to think about when we are supporting children moving forward within the system? Dare not to ask. But if we don't ask, who's going to do that? Okay. Then it was really clear as well around, well, actually, I've never really heard about that culture. I've never heard of that tradition. I've never heard of that language. I've never heard of that ritual. I've never heard of that religion. So because I've never really heard of that, it's very difficult for me to have a conversation about that. But I think we do need to be thinking about doing our own research before we start engaging with it. So those were some of the barriers, I think, that resistance to engage with different cultures and something new. And because of that, then it becomes very difficult to think about what we need to include in fostering plans and adoption plans for children. Okay, contact is an interesting one because we still hear narratives, particularly around the challenges of contact. And some of the birth parents I've spoken with, they're still struggling to navigate the contact system. And as much as adoption in the UK is now moving to open adoption and openness to adoption and thinking about supporting contact between children who've been adopted and also their birth parents, but there's some resistance, I think, particularly the idea of being risk averse. It might be unsafe, but of course there needs to be risk assessments. But that creates a challenge and that contributes to the racial trauma for children if we want to think about it. But also the idea that it's not always easy to think outside of the Eurocentric perspective as well when we're thinking about children of different cultures. So that, in my view, is something else that also needs to change in the way that we look at contact, particularly for children of racialized and minoritized backgrounds. Okay, so meanwhile, while all this is happening, we're continuing to see systemic inequalities. We're continuing to see shortages of adopters purely because there's lifestyle judgments. If we look at research, there's lifestyle judgments for Black and Asian adopters who are looking to adopt. There are also some concerns around maybe financial capabilities. The goalposts change, and why I say that is that when I've spoken with adopters, is that actually when they came in, they said, wow, we are nearly there, but there's another thing, you haven't painted the bedroom, for example. Yeah, the room was large enough, but now it's not large enough anymore. Now this is, so those are the barriers that Black adopters continue to face, which also contributes to the systemic barriers that we have. So I think we need to be moving towards becoming more culturally inclusive, I suppose, in the way that we do things for us to be able to cover the gap and provide more adopters for children of this background. So I've got some quotations here from the research that we've done. And I've spoken about practitioners, where they're coming from, and this is really thinking particularly about adopters. And some adopters were saying that we don't know how to protect her. This was an adoptive parent who was talking about their child and their experience of hair care. And what they were saying here is that we don't know how to protect her from this world, how to prepare her for what she'll face because of her skin color. The truth is, we never talked about race or religion or anything like that. Even though there were clearly times when Black people were on the news, we just wanted her to be like all of us and not to feel different, you know. Maybe we should have. How do you even begin when you don't know where to start? The world was telling her one thing, and we're telling her something different, but there's a disconnect. So I think they're reflecting now, but it's several years later. But clearly, if you really unpick this quotation, there are some challenges in terms of the child's sense of belonging. So this is particularly thinking about the training that is provided in relation to the preparation for BICS workshops. So preparation for BICS, if I can just break that down, is preparing prospective adopters and foster carers to teach their children around how do you challenge racism, engaging in what Black communities would call a race talk. You know, you sit your child down and you say racism is going to be like this is how you deal with it. And sometimes prospective adopters, they don't really know how to deal with that, and that training needs to be covering all these elements. So this adoptive parent was telling me about their experience and their child at this point 3 years old. So adopted, name of child, a 3-year-old. So they adopted them at 8 months ago, which was at the time of the interview. And we were on a taxi, and the taxi driver asked us, where is the mother? So clearly, and this was a gay couple. Here's another situation. I want to check with you, Tam. We went to an Afro hairdresser's to get her hair fixed, and we're not getting quite right. The hairdresser asked me, are you sure you know what you're doing with this hair? So his response was, I have a friend helping me with what we need to do with it, but she gets very busy and it's not always easy to keep asking. I feel like we're a burden already. Okay. She was quite offish with me and said, it's not good enough. You should have thought about these things properly before adopting a Black child. You can't just know these things. There's a lot there. Okay, so first of all, the microaggressions in regards to the couple, in regards to their, obviously, gender and sexuality, and secondly, in regards to the race, so which is something that they were bringing forward to me to kind of explore this. Then, of course, from their perspective, we went to a Black hairdresser's because we needed, obviously, to make sure that the child's hair was looked after properly. But within that space, they also experienced microaggressions. So their point was, how do I deal with this now? So wherever you go, it's microaggressions. But the question really, I think, from the hairdresser was, it's not good enough. You should have thought about these things. And if you look at, we've got some resources on Adoption England that we've done, and a young man, Anthony, talks about his own experience of needing support with hair care and what that means. And I think it's also important to think about hair as a source of trauma if it's not looked after, and what hairdressers do in terms of the space as well and the support that it provides to Black children. I can also add here in another interview where an adoptee was telling me that actually their mother was very uncomfortable about being in Black spaces. So the hairdressers, doing the right thing, dropping the child to the hairdressers, but the hairdressers was in a Black community. Mom is white, but she could not bear to be in that space. She was very uncomfortable. So it was a quick drive drop off. Quick pick, drive off. And this participant remembers this, and it was very difficult for them, that you can't also bear to be in this community, or indeed to be in the space where I'm getting my hair done, and what that means in terms of socialization. So it goes back to that idea of superficial, and it goes back actually maybe to this point here. You should have thought about these things properly. So in terms of the lived reality of trauma, let's see. So I've given you some examples of some adoptees I spoke with, and here's another example from adoptees' lived experience, particularly if you want to think about trauma as well. So this participant was speaking about their experience. So it was like being handed a jigsaw with pieces of different boxes. My parents couldn't quite see what I saw in the mirror. When I looked at myself, I hated my looks. And the worst thing is, I didn't feel like a real person. You can go further with some of the narratives as well that we heard. Others saying they wanted to scrub their skin, they wanted to bleach their skin. Others were promised that we can get you medication to change your skin color to be white. These are real narratives that we heard. And then we hear, I was looking in the mirror, seeing something different. Okay. But it wasn't my responsibility to make the image of our family match my reality. It was their duty to create that picture. Okay, and here's another quotation. My parents had never experienced racism, and they had no tools with anything to deal with anything like this. I was getting all the time racism, all the time. All they said was, ignore it. Cry or walk away. I grew to internalize racism, envied those who could fight for themselves. So it goes back to what I spoke about in terms of preparation for bias and the race talk. And this adoptee didn't have that. Ended up feeling isolated, never had backing from anyone, isolation. I didn't have the language for what it was. I was depressed and tired of feeling I didn't belong in the space I lived, in my mind and my body. Psychological homelessness, internalized pain. Didn't have the words to express this. Walk away or cry. So this is another participant who speaks very, very powerfully. And if you've got the AFDiT booklet, I'll give you the website later on. And this participant was talking about how they felt rejected in the white side. So they were adopted by a white family, adopted by their mixed race, adopted, and the white side they felt rejected, in the black side they felt rejected, to the point that they also tried to go to Africa to try and understand who they are, but even then felt rejected. So where do I belong? So that idea of you've got nowhere you belong, and for others having that feeling of actually I'm sitting in between, and it gets quite confusing and it's very complex. So I think there's a lot here to try and process, I think, in terms of what these narratives are telling us and the reality of this. And when you listen to adoptees speaking, they say, this is lifelong. And it continues to affect you no matter how much you grow in your adult years. Some of the participants were way beyond 50s. And others are teenagers that I've spoken with. Others middle age, but still it's lifelong, trying to deal with this. So having thought about all this and reflecting on the context of transracial adoption and fostering in the UK, I think it's clear that we have a system where we need to work with what we have, but what we need to do is to prevent trauma, racial trauma, and to change the narratives, particularly around identity outcomes. So in thinking about this, we developed the AFDiT framework. So within the AFDiT framework, there's the AFDiT Wheel, and then also the assessment skills that are intended to support decision making. So I'm just going to talk about what the AFDiT Wheel looks like. So this is the AFDiT Wheel. And what's intended to do is really to allow us to think about the child's sense of self in different ways, I guess, and in as much as we could around identity facets. This is what we came up with: religion, race, ethnicity, heritage, language, diet, ethnic cultural care, and values, particularly for those who might not be spiritual or religious. So when you're looking at this well, it's thinking about how, I think the starting point to think about this is when a child is within their birth family, they feel reassured about their identity. They get an experience of immersion. There's understanding, there's security, there's comfort, all that they experience and they observe. But unfortunately, when children move from foster care to foster care, sometimes all those drop, or some drop. So the argument within this will is that when any of these drops, you're likely to see a child who's going to experience trauma. So we need to avoid that. So that's the framework. So this framework is intended to support, I think we need to think about this in terms of children's identity from pre-adoption, thinking about how we record, detailed recording of children's identity, and to use the wheel as a way of supporting identity outcomes, but also having discussions, particularly where we've been hearing it's difficult to have conversations about race. But actually what the tool does, it allows you to think about how can we have some discussions around race. Then exploration of identity and thinking about transracial placements in that way, but also thinking about what strategies can be put in place to support children's identity, but at the same time evaluating capacity to address some of these challenges, and also willingness to provide the support that is needed for children in the long term, including therapeutic support. So the argument with this is that actually the invitation is that we ask ourselves, whether we're researchers or practitioners, to look at that wheel actually first ourselves and explore that. Where do I sit within this? And then use that as a tool to have conversations with foster carers and adoptive parents. Here are just some examples of some of the questions in the framework, really. So it will be about asking foster carers and adopters, what strategies might you use to support the child's identity, the child's cultural identity, and also what plans do you have to ensure that the child's supported in terms of their cultural and sense of belonging. So if we then want to think about the assessment scales within the framework, these are grounded within the concepts I mentioned earlier, which is the racial and cultural consciousness and the race and cultural intentionality. And the two, I suppose the difference, the argument is that one is being conscious of your own identity, and then also being conscious of the child's identity and what they need and the reality of systemic racism, for example, and challenges that they may encounter based on some of the research we spoke about. And intentionality really is about thinking strategically about what the child needs and making sure that is in place and provided for. So this is the model. And the invitation, I suppose, is that to assess people, which we know that hearing from social workers is very difficult to assess and to grade adopters, but the idea of the framework is that we have accountability for children to prevent trauma, so we need to do this. So the scales range from evasiveness, of course, to a higher level of understanding of a child's identity in terms of consciousness, and then to a higher level of understanding what exactly the child needs and what needs to be provided, for example, not necessarily being colorblind. So evasiveness here, you would argue that that would be somebody who say, I don't see color. So if you don't see color, how necessarily are you going to provide for the child's needs? I'm not seeing ethnicity or culture, for example. Yeah, and then maybe someone with basic awarenesses, they do know that they need to provide, but actually they're not very clear about how much and what exactly they need to put in place. And then the scale carries on. I've got some copies which I can share with you, and also I'll provide the website. Then in doing that assessment, what the social workers will then need to do is they do their grading, their assessment of them, then come with some recommendations. What we're hearing from social workers who are using this framework is that actually, once you start having conversations, it's possible that adopters then move through the scale. And some of the questions that we're hearing is that actually, how does the social worker know? Actually, so then that's the work that we need to do as social workers to be able to know what in terms of the child's specific needs, what a 3 looks like. And another point that was made by adoptive parents was that actually if you think an adopter is a 4 and they're not showing you that they're still willing to learn, then that's a problem, because a 4 doesn't mean there's no opportunities to learn. There's always an opportunity to grow and develop. Okay, so this should be my last slide. So in doing this assessment, the AFDiT framework introduces some decision values, and these decision values include power, privilege, and bias in respect of, one, the social worker, but also to be able to explore some of these things in respect of foster carers and adopters. Then the need to collaborate with birth parents. Accurate recording, in my view, is so important, because actually if a child's identity is not recorded well, lots of things are going to be missed. Then the point around cultivating connection around difference, and certainly the race trauma, because we need to, in social work, we understand childhood adversities, absolutely, and we understand that children in adoption may well have experienced trauma, but what is missing is the understanding of racial trauma in our practice. So that's important as well, to think about that and the importance of identity affirmation. Okay, so really what we're saying is that AFDiT allows us to think differently. I'm hoping it is, and I'm hearing that it is, to think differently about what we need to do, but importantly actually to see the risks of race trauma in transracial placements that we need to disrupt. But also it gives us the opportunity to confront systemic racism. So I want to close this talk today by just bringing an Afrocentric, if you like, perspective to this as a way of disrupting the way we think in a Eurocentric perspective, which is I see you, sawubona. And this means I'm seeing you, the child, the whole of you, and the risks of trauma perhaps that might arise if we miss things, if we don't look at the AFDiT Wheel and understand the child's sense of self in that holistic way. But also, I see you with an intersectional lens, and I see you that we really need to understand the complexity of identity. I see you because forgiveness in the Ubuntu way, in the Nelson Mandela way, means we are accepting the reality of inequalities, but we are also accepting that the burden shouldn't fall on the child. So just ending. We started off with the jacaranda, we end with the jacaranda. So what we want to do is to sweep off, jack off jacaranda. We need to understand that actually, yes, it's beautiful, but actually there's slugginess, and it might smell if we don't get it right. So actually maybe we need to keep sweeping the jacaranda so that actually it doesn't get, the jacaranda falls, it doesn't get sluggy. But alongside that we're saying, I see you. And also, I'm giving you the broom to sweep off so that in the work that we're doing, there's no slugginess. Thank you very much.